Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this presentation by Professor Daniel Ziblatt here at ASU. We're really delighted to have him join our series of talks on the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Before we start the proceedings, I'd like to thank a few people. First, I'd like to thank the German Embassy in Washington, DC for providing the funding for making this series of talks possible. I'd like to thank my colleague here, Volker Benkert, for his support and organizing the whole process, really. I'd obviously like to thank Daniel Ziblatt for being our guest this afternoon. The School of Politics and Global Studies here at ASU, the School of Historical, Philosophical and Religious Studies at ASU, and finally our wonderful staff member, Matt Oxford, who is our Promotions and Communications Manager in the department. Thank you very much for making all of this possible. And obviously, thank you all for attending. Our guest this afternoon is Professor Daniel Ziblatt. He is the Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard University, and also quite recently has become the Director of the Transformations of Democracy Group at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, or the Social Science Center in Berlin. He's a leading expert on the history of democracy and the process of democratization in Europe, in Central Europe in particular, and Western Europe as well. In 2017, he published a prize-winning book titled Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracies in Europe with Cambridge University Press. And even more relevant to his topic today is his 2018 book with Stephen Levitsky titled How Democracies Die. So we're absolutely thrilled to have Professor Ziblatt with us here this afternoon to speak on the topic of Weimar democracy and lessons for the contemporary United States. So without further ado, welcome and take it away, Professor Ziblatt.
Yes, thank you, Henry. Thank you, Volker. Sorry to not be there in person, which I always like to visit Arizona, but that'll have to wait for some other year. So great to have the opportunity to talk to you today. I've been asked to discuss democracy and dictatorship in Germany and what lessons we can learn for American democracy today. And so I have to admit that I take on this assignment with a little bit of trepidation and a bit of modesty, I guess, in the sense that, there's nothing worse than misplaced historical analogies, because, armed with historical analogies, we can be easily led astray. But nonetheless, I will proceed and try to give comments on exactly this, extract lessons from the past for the present. And I'm going to primarily focus on the lessons of Germany's first experiment with democracy, the Weimar Republic, the short-lived experiment with democracy between 1918 and 1933. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what can we possibly learn from this ultimately failed experiment with democracy? What lessons can we draw from that for one of the most long-standing democracies in the United States? And indeed, I think this is a great question because there are a lot of differences in context that are striking and important. Now, first of all, Germany in 1918 was a new democracy with a new constitution, new institutions, new parties, all imposed to a degree from outside, Germany having lost World War I. So the practices and routines of democracy, full parliamentary democracy, were relatively new. Similarly, German society after 1918, 1919, had just undergone an utterly wrenching destruction and violence, making it a very precariously fragile society, I would argue. And third, there was a big difference in the sense that contemporary America and Weimar, in the sense that kind of rapid and deep economic devastation triggered by the Great Depression in the late 1920s and exacerbated by the poor state of economic policy making in this period. And of course, this is a kind of before there's a kind of pre-Keynesian world. This economic crisis in Weimar Germany far surpassed even the serious economic challenges facing the United States today. So economic crises were on a kind of vastly different scale. So there are these serious differences, and we don't want to overlook those. Yet there were and are some underlying similar democratic ailments. I understand this is a provocative point, again, because of the calamitous ending of the Weimar Republic, but I think this calamitous ending shouldn't prevent us from making comparisons, because I think comparisons can still be useful. So these underlying democratic ailments, I think arguably in the United States, can be much more successfully contained, but some of the symptoms, I think, are nonetheless quite similar. So to put this in another way, I mean, you can think of a star athlete and an unhealthy lifelong smoker are very different. right? And they can react to the contracting of a common disease in very different ways. And that may make all the difference. Yet it still makes sense to track the course of the disease, because even though it may kill a lifelong smoker, it can seriously debilitate a star athlete for a long time. And in worst case scenario, it too can kill a star athlete. So getting our grips on this ailment is worth doing. So that indeed is really the first point I want to make today, which is that the Weimar experience teaches us that when it comes to regime survival and death, nothing is inevitable. Nothing is inevitable. The survival of democracy or the death of democracy hinges on institutions. And institutions are defended by people, individuals making right choices or wrong choices. Now, there's this view out there that's pretty common of the Weimar experience among historians. You know, the Weimar, as I've said, was born out of war, the humiliation of having lost a war, some of its territory, its monarch. So there's this view that given all of this, that democracy was simply doomed. On another account, the way the regime was created, a failed revolution in 1918, so a kind of revolution that began but then was thwarted ultimately, was insufficient to overthrow the militaristic power and order, a pre-war order. So both of these accounts kind of assume that democracy had these fatal flaws from the beginning. And actually a great historian, Gordon Craig, puts it this way. He says that the Weimar Republic's basic vulnerability was rooted in the circumstances of its creation. And it's no exaggeration to say, Craig continues, that it failed in the end, partly because German officers were allowed to put their epaulettes back on them so quickly, and because the public buildings were not burned down along with the bureaucrats in them. So Weimar, on Craig's account, suffered a birth defect, and its demise in some level was inevitable. So I disagree with this. That's, again, the first kind of main point that I want to make. I mean, there is a grain of truth in this account. I mean, the way that German nationalists responded to defeat in World War I provided fertile soil for anti-rationalism, for chauvinistic nationalism that demagogues certainly could go on and exploit throughout the 1920s and 30s, which they did. And that made the regime incredibly fragile. And it's a truism in politics, I mean, as in life, perhaps, I guess, that character is revealed in the face of defeat. And we've actually seen this, I would argue, since November 3rd in American politics. The response to defeat in World War I among German nationalists was certainly not a gracious losing, a gracious accepting of defeat, but was instead the construction of a kind of myth, flight into mythology, as one historian has described it, the claim that Germany wasn't really defeated. It had only been defeated with a stab in the back, famously, by some vague conspiratorial mix of communists, Jews, and liberals. This, of course, was nonsense. But one German leader, nationalist, described the feeling at the time, and I think this captures it a bit. He said, "We had thought we were the Romans. We discovered we were the Carthaginians." So in the face of such shocking defeat, it kind of makes sense that legends emerge. But not accepting defeat, is constructing what we could, nowadays, I guess, would call a fake news legend of a defeat from within by Jews, liberals, and communists, was more than just a way of coping with defeat. It provided a highly destructive legend that formed the basis of nasty and violent anti-regime nationalism that never accepted the legitimacy of the new democratic regime. It was a vulnerability of Weimar from that point on. And so, and this again is a lesson for today's America, the dead enders, I would say, of Trumpism, who have begun constructing the legend that November 3rd wasn't really a defeat, that voting machines were actually all, in fact, sabotaged by Chinese and Venezuelan government officials, or that city political machines in places like Detroit and Philadelphia stole the election. This is dangerous stuff. I mean, such flights into mythology aren't just harmless stories. They have the potential to undermine the legitimacy of the subsequent leaders and regime itself. In Weimar Germany, the World War I myths provided the raw materials of an anti-regime nationalism that ultimately helped kill Weimar. But the mere presence of this legend, the creation of this anti-regime nationalism beginning in 1918, 1919, didn't doom Weimar from the outset. Again, nothing is inevitable. So I just would like to just tell a little story from the period that kind of makes this point. So in 1922, June 1922, 3 years into the life of the Weimar Republic, German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau, who was a German Jew, was one of the first foreign ministers of the new regime, was chauffeured in his convertible from the leafy Grunewald suburb outside of Berlin, where he lived, to his foreign ministry office. And this is a summer day, warm summer day. As he was stopped at a traffic light, a Mercedes pulled up alongside him, and the two occupants of the Mercedes alongside him, armed with machine guns, opened fire and assassinated Rathenau in broad daylight. This is an incredible moment of tragedy, showing the vulnerability of the new regime to violence and nationalism. So assassinations inspired by this kind of nationalism had happened before and was destabilizing to the regime. But what's interesting, I think, is that the public reaction to this, to the murder, also underscores the idea that the founding years of the regime didn't doom it. I mean, it's certainly true that this murder by rabid right-wingers who thought that he was a traitor to Germany, and partly because of being a German Jew, because this certainly all crystallized in a moment, really, the kind of contention and uprising and violence that German society faced. And this, in fact, it came only 2 years after a failed coup attempt in 1920. So the regime was quite fragile. I don't want to overstate how stable things were. And in fact, the assassination of Rathenau triggered an escalation. After Rathenau's death, the far right and left, on the floor of the parliament, accused each other of murder and treason and so on. But something really remarkable happened, which is worth noting, which is that 3 days after the murder, on June 27, 1922, German politics experienced what you can kind of think of as a quasi-truce, at least for a moment, a hopeful truce. So the first state funeral was held for in Germany since the death of Otto von Bismarck in 1898 for the German foreign minister who had been assassinated. It was held in the building of the Reichstag, and there was a New York Times correspondent on hand in Berlin who described it. And just to quote from him, he said, "Wreaths of red roses, tea roses, and blue hydrangeas adorn the chamber floor. The symbol of the eagle appears overhead as the red, black, and gold flag of the Republic drapes the plain oak coffin at the center of the assembly floor. The Social Democratic president, Friedrich Ebert, rises before a chamber that's filled to capacity with dignitaries ranging from Albert Einstein to foreign diplomats and members of the German parliament. And reactionary conservatives and communists alike are all solemnly dressed in black. Ebert delivered brief remarks honoring Rathenau's life and contributions to the German people." And then the New York Times correspondent goes on to say, "Even the communists and the arch reactionaries behaved decorously." So both sides, in a sense, came together in this particular moment. And so rather than catapulting Germany into a kind of democratic collapse, this moment of potential breakdown, it turned into a kind of moment of, at least momentarily, solidarity, sidestepping the kind of institutional crisis that had proved really lethal, actually, in a bunch of other democracies in this period. So in Italy, in the early 20s, Mussolini came to power. Regimes were unstable in Portugal, Spain in the early 20s as well. So Germany began the 1920s, despite all of these challenges, with a remarkable level of legitimacy, given all of the challenges it faced. And indeed, by 1924, a lot of historians talk about the kind of golden age of Weimar, which began after around 1924, an era of relative stabilization. So all of this makes the point again that this regime wasn't doomed. And regime death, I think, is really not inevitable. But I want to be careful here, because even if regime death is not inevitable, so too is regime survival not inevitable. And this is really important point to make, I think, because the Weimar's end kind of makes us often, and the way it ended calamitously, makes us often kind of overlook, I would say, some of the promising conditions associated with the Weimar Republic. I mean, there are few facts, for example, in social science that are as well established as the basic idea that high levels of GDP per capita correlate with democratic survival. So having high GDP per capita, high wealth, seem to almost inoculate a country from democratic breakdown. I mean, rich democracies don't die. I mean, there's few facts that we can all agree upon, but that's one. And so when Germany democratized in 1918, and when it died 15 years later, it was actually one of the wealthiest countries in the world. I mean, Germany was richer than France, richer than Denmark, richer than Sweden, and nearly as rich as Great Britain. These were countries where democracy survived after 1918, and these were all countries where democracy, in some of them at least, were relatively new. Additionally, Germany in this period had a very powerful working class, which was organized in the very pro-democratic Social Democratic Party. Germany had a big middle class, one of the kind of buttresses of democracy, had a vibrant civil society, possessed a strong rule of law tradition and a constitution that had been written by leading figures like Max Weber and Otto Preuss, who were or Hugo Preuss, who were eminent sociologists and legal thinkers, who designed this constitution at the time was really well regarded. So if nothing is inevitable, what went wrong? Why did none of this work? Why did all these characteristics not work out? With this question, I want to turn now to the second lesson of the Weimar experience, because what often kills democracy, and what killed democracy, played a big role in killing democracy in Weimar Germany, was elite miscalculation. Indeed, I would argue that what went wrong in Weimar Germany was a lot of elite miscalculation. Elites made profound mistakes when facing democratic challenges. And these mistakes were incredibly consequential. And there's actually something, I think, to be learned from these mistakes. It's not just bad decisions. There's something systematic that one can say about it. So one of the eyewitnesses to the collapse of German democracy, Karl Lowenstein, who's a liberal political scientist who escaped from Germany and immigrated to the US in the 1930s and ended up at Amherst College, which is just down the street from where I'm speaking to you guys today. He wrote an essay in the American Political Science Review in 1937. It's a two-part essay spread out over 2 issues. He assessed the lessons of Weimar, again, writing in 1937, so 4 years after Hitler had come to power, as a liberal. And he wrote, "Democracy is the Trojan horse by which the enemy enters the gate." Now, Lowenstein was a advocate of democracy, but he also thought that the Weimar experience exposed a vulnerability of democracy more generally. Democracy, the Trojan horse by which the enemy enters the gate. So the vulnerability that he's pointing to is one that a lot of people probably presume that democracy possesses. That is, that voters can elect autocrats. Voters can elect autocrats, and that democracy can in fact die at the ballot box. This is the story that Steve Levitsky and I tell in our book, How Democracies Die. This happened in the 1930s in Germany. And this is correct. This is a correct assessment of what happened. But from my view, it only tells half the story. Because I think Lowenstein, in a sense, makes an error that many of us make today as well, which is to think that because democracy dies at the ballot box, the democracy is most fundamentally threatened by voters who are not sufficiently committed to liberal democracy. I mean, this is really an old fear, going back to John Stuart Mill. What if voters are not ready for democracy? This is also a fear that animates those who fear populism in the contemporary world, that maybe the great unwashed illiberal majorities will vote autocrats into power and stamp on people's civil liberties and so on. I think this fear is actually overstated, and it's not the right lesson to learn from Weimar. You have to remember that when the Nazi Party came to power, its before it came to power, its membership had never peaked above about 2% of the population. Hitler's party never got more than 33% of the vote in free and fair elections before January 1933, when democracy died. Now, of course, I don't want to understate this as well. Whenever you have a third of the electorate supporting a Nazi party, this is a big problem. It's important not to understate this. And because this was a malignant and destructive social movement that posed a real threat to German democracy, we have to take this seriously. But we also have to remember that 70% of Germans voted against Hitler, even at the peak level of the Nazi party's popularity in free and fair elections. So what's my point here? My point is that as important as the Trojan horse of democracy may have been, just as important were the gatekeepers who let the Trojan horse into the city. We have to pay attention to the gatekeepers who let the Nazis into power. So to put this differently, authoritarians come to power, they come into office not on their own, but really with the enabling aid of political allies from the political establishment. This is a central lesson, in my view, of the Weimar breakdown. Adolf Hitler didn't come to power on his own. He was really a marginal figure early in the 20s, jailed in 1923 after his infamous beer hall putsch. But he was elevated in a series of short-term strategies unintentionally by the DNVP, which is the German, essentially more mainstream, relatively mainstream conservative party, the Nationalist Party in the Weimar years. Now, this party, the DNVP, sorry to use the acronym, Germany's Conservative Party, was really cobbled together after 1918, tried to establish itself as a relatively mainstream party, as the dominant conservative party within the new regime. And by the 1920s, this party, this DNVP party, had around 20% of the vote, making it Germany's second most popular party after the SPD, the main center-left party. Prominent leaders within this party looked to Britain and wanted to make make this party what one historian has called a Tory Conservative Party. The party entered government, but after a big electoral loss in 1928, right-wing members, there had always been a much more radical right-wing side to this party, rejected the kind of moderating course of the ENVP party and sought a more radical anti-democratic course. Now, at the center of this story, this internal fight in the center of this conservative party, the DNVP, was a 65-year-old man named Alfred Hugenberg, who was a kind of stodgy guy, horn-rimmed glasses, a big mustache, sort of looks like a butcher if you see photographs of him, an old-time, German butcher or something. He's just a kind of regular-looking guy, originally a civil servant. He had moved on to a business career and become actually very successful board member in the Krupp Industries, the armament manufacturer. He built a big political base, though, and he used his industrial connections to found a communications empire, including owning newspapers, Germany's official wire service, book publishing houses, movie theaters. And he had little kind of natural political appeal, but he had incredible fundraising capacities. He raised a lot of money, became the main conduit for political money from industrialists to this conservative party, the DNVP. And he funded a lot of the local associations, and he used those connections eventually to get himself as selected head of this party, the DNVP, after 1928. So this guy who had never held political office, very little charisma, no charisma, was now chairman of this party. But he became chairman of the party right as this DNV party began to shrink. And he made this calculation. He looked out on the horizon of the German political landscape and he saw the energetic brown-shirted Nazis marching in the streets. And Hugenberg was a nationalist, and he saw a way of rescuing his own party. Again, he thought this party was going to be the master of the kind of right side of the political spectrum. He thought he could ally with what looked like a pretty popular movement, the Nazis. So in 1928, Hugenberg decided what he would do in order to keep his own party's dominance of that conservative end of the spectrum. He would start to cooperate with the Nazis. In particular, what he did is he sponsored a national referendum along with a group of other right-wing groups and the Nazis that would make it a criminal offense, this is to be voted on by the German public, for German officials to comply with the payment of reparations to foreign powers. And this goes back to the story about the stab in the back myth. Now, the real goal of this agenda was to really keep his party relevant. He was trying to kind of stoke outrage to be the head of the kind of right wing of the political spectrum. The proposal went down to defeat, but that was fine because the actual goal was really the mass mobilization of the referendum. But dangerously, what this also did is it elevated Hitler. Hitler was now a partner in this movement. 1931, once again, he kind of carried out the same strategy and held a joint rally with the Nazi party in this small resort town in Germany called Bad Harzburg, where he was going to have this big event. There was lots of media there. He was hoping to be the head of this nationalist movement. He invited Hitler's Nazi party, a bunch of other right-wing groups. But Hitler, always the master of kind of being a showman, showed up late to the event, showed up in their uniforms. They marched right past Hugenberg, and all the media reported on this as Hitler having kind of won the day. This further marginalized Hugenberg, making him increasingly relevant, raising again the status of Hitler as a national figure. So the point that I'm trying to make with these stories is that establishment politicians in this case provided an extremist outsider, Adolf Hitler and his party, with a critical resource, respectability, but did more than that, because out of some kind of combination of fear, ambition, ideological collusion, miscalculation, he had, in a sense, begun to do more, begun to hand power to Hitler. And this really came to a head in January 1933 in a very famous story. By the time Hitler's party then started to do very well on elections, January 1933, as the conservative elites were trying to kind of maneuver and figure out how to deal with Hitler's growing popularity. There's this discussion of, well, we appoint him chancellor, maybe we can tame him. And the very famous line, the conservative German statesman Franz von Papen tried to kind of ease the worries of his conservative allies and said, we appoint him chancellor, it's okay. And in von Papen's famous last words, he said, don't worry, within 2 months, we'll have pushed Hitler so far into a corner, he'll squeal. Of course, tragic miscalculation. A bigger miscalculation is hard to imagine. Again, it was elite miscalculation and abdication that gave Germany, Hitler. A similar story, I should add, can be told about Italy and Mussolini's rise to power, and Mussolini's kind of famous march on Rome. I mean, one often hears that the way that Mussolini came to power was leading troops into Rome and conquered Rome. Really, the story is much more mundane. He took an overnight train to Rome. He arrived in Rome, went to his hotel. Are you guys having trouble hearing me? Is the connection okay? Okay, sorry. Arrived, went to his hotel, changed into a kind of bowler hat and a black sports coat, went to go meet the king, and the king offered him the premiership. And so it was a very much a constitutional process. Mussolini tried to kind of tell the story that this was this kind of great, storming of Rome. And in fact, actually, when he was coming in by train, one of the famous stories about Mussolini was right before they got to Rome. He was consulting with his advisors, and he was thinking that he should be let off the train outside of Rome and be given a horse and come into Rome on horse to kind of propagate this myth of a kind of groundswell from below. And in fact, this is sort of the story that was told in textbooks for Italian children during the fascist period, but it was a much more mundane process. Essentially what had happened was Mussolini had been placed on, had been the head of an obscure political party that didn't have much support, was included on a party list by the liberal statesmen at the time, because they saw lots of energy on this side of the spectrum, elevated Mussolini's popularity, and in a kind of miscalculation, the Italian king appointed Mussolini prime minister, and the rest is history in terms of Italian democracy. So again, profound miscalculations all around. So, and again, I don't want to understate the kind of power of fascism and authoritarian social movements. These were real. They were built on these resentments that I described earlier. But my point is that when extremists first arrive on the scene and appear to threaten democracy, the lesson of these stories, the lessons from the Weimar experiences, they should be taken seriously. These actors should be marginalized, not embraced for short-term gain, helping bolster their legitimacy. And then second, even more critically, I think, is that when clearly anti-democratic coalitions, even sometimes very uncomfortable coalitions, with parties they may disagree with in order to keep extremists out of power. This didn't happen in Weimar Germany. This didn't happen in 1920s Italy, but it is possible in other places, and it has been possible in other places, and sometimes happened in other places. To give you another example from this same time period, in 1930s Belgium, a far-right fascist political party inspired by the Nazis, the Rexist Party, was on the verge of gaining power in the 1930s through a coalition with the right-wing Catholic Party. So this Rexist Party, again, inspired by Hitler and Mussolini and getting some support from them, held his own march on Brussels. I mean, this was sort of the trope. In this instance, though, the idea was that the Catholic Party might, maybe the right-wing Catholic Party might collaborate with this right-wing fascist party. In this instance, though, the Belgian king used his moral authority. He got to the socialists and the Catholics, who were sworn enemies, who disagreed about just about on everything, got them together in a room. And although the socialists and the Catholics disagreed about everything, he convinced them to cooperate to keep the Rexists out of power. They wouldn't cooperate with the Rexist Party, and they came up with a strategy for isolating and keeping this party far from power. So again, the lesson of this story is that mainstream politicians and parties have a key role to play. I mean, there can be genuine threats, but this doesn't condemn a democracy to death. When mainstream establishment politicians, by contrast, open the door, abdicate, fail in their gatekeeping function, again, out of miscalculation, out of opportunism, and they let extremists in the door, in every instance, this kind of Faustian bargain backfires. I mean, there's always this kind of mistaken belief, well, we can control the demagogue. We can use the demagogue for our own purposes. But very often, the establishment politicians lose control. So those are the two main points I want to make. One, that the collapse of democracy and the survival of democracy is not inevitable. I mean, certainly certain conditions make it more likely. High GDP per capita does, a long history of democracy does. But in retrospect, what often looks inevitable, the closer you look at it, you realize is very contingent. And that's one of the kind of interesting things about studying historical cases very closely. You see all of the decision points where things might have gone another way. So again, nothing is inevitable. But the point about regime collapse not being inevitable also means the regime survival is not inevitable. The age of democracy, as I've said, and the wealth of democracy make American democracy in a certain way more like the star athlete that I talked about than the unhealthy smoker. I mean, it's a pretty old democracy. It's a wealthy democracy. But even the crudest form of modernization, it doesn't just expect that rich wealth and age automatically inoculate a democracy from breakdown. I mean, age and wealth is thought to protect democracy because when a country has these characteristics, when it's threatened, citizens are expected and must come to democracy's defense. And the notion is that a society that has these characteristics is going to trigger a response, which will help defend democracy by either turning out to vote, by protesting democratic abuses, by voting against politicians who violate democratic norms. When people came out in the streets in 1920 or came and showed their support for the regime in 1922, 1924, when facing a coup attempt, this is what happened with Rathenau in 1923. I mean, this is what helped make democracy survive. And so sometimes people make the mistake of saying, well, hey, look at democracy has survived these threats. We didn't need to be worried. I mean, this is a little bit, there's a kind of what the sociologist Robert Burton calls the logic of the self-defeating prophecy. When you see something bad happening and you prepare for it, you can forestall that eventuality from coming. If you think you're not well prepared for an exam as a student, you then prepare for it and then you succeed on it. That doesn't mean that you would have done well had you not prepared for it. So similarly, wealth and age of a democracy only inoculate you from democratic threats if people mobilize and act in ways that help defend democracy. So that's the first point. The second point that I'd like to close with is that democracy, I think the second big lesson I would take from the account that I've just given you is that democracy can die at the hands of elites. Making common cause, even if for short-term strategic purpose, with clearly anti-democratic forces. This can kill democracies as well. And so democracies don't as much often with mass uprisings. I mean, this may provide the context and provide some of the threats, but it dies when elites don't respond to these kinds of threats and don't respond to demagogues in their own midst in ways that isolate them. And so something similar, I would argue, happened in the United States in 2016. The Republicans enabled Donald Trump. Many leading Republicans, even after candidate Trump won the nomination back in 2016, openly despised and were offended by Donald Trump and thought he was unfit for office. I mean, they could have crossed party lines way back then, but of course they didn't. This would have made a huge difference, arguably, in 2016. Because again, as we've seen, once a politician with autocratic tendencies is in the door, is in power, it's a changed game. And so, when my co-author of my book, How Democracies Die, Steve Levitsky, and I wrote our book, 2018, we had expected and hoped that Republicans would stand up to President Trump if he crossed the line of democratic norms and rhetorically or behaviorally during the first years. They didn't. And so the result, I would argue, is the calamity that we've been facing, including their silence since November 3rd, when it's very clear that President Trump lost the election, but many Republicans are very hesitant to speak out. So my main point then is this, and I think, again, a lesson, certainly the rise of demagogues who find popular support as a major threat to democracy, but a key role has to be played by political elites and political establishments. And finally, a final note then is just, when does this happen? When do politicians behave in this way and when don't they? I mean, I don't think it's just a matter of political courage, although that certainly helps. But it also requires that mainstream parties and politicians not be so fearful of the other side that they're willing to overlook abuses on their own side. Some really fascinating research, a political scientist at Yale University, Milan Cvolik, in these survey experiments that he does with voters, shows that voters are much more likely to overlook democratic norm violations of the candidates they support who are on their side of the aisle if they feel that they're ideologically distant from the opposition. So the greater the ideological distance and social distance from their rivals, the more likely you are to overlook abuses on your own side. And so, in a different way to put this is polarization and fear of losing makes establishment politicians not to be successful gatekeepers. And so I think the biggest challenge for American democracy today is that our own Republican Party, like Germany's conservatives, is fearful of the future. And it represents a declining segment of the electorate, mostly white, non-urban, low population density areas. And the segment of the electorate that it primarily represents is quite bleak. And until the Republican Party changes, our system will continue to be vulnerable to this. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ziblatt. That was great. I'd like to ask all of our attendees and audience members to go ahead and submit questions through the Q&A function. We already have several, and I think I'll start by asking or combining two questions here. We have two questions about the role of political institutions. So the first is asking whether you think that the checks and balances in the United States Constitution could help stop an autocratic leader from achieving his or her goals. But the second asks which reforms of the political system could make the democracy more responsive or resilient in the United States. So two questions about the US political institutional structures and how they constrain or do not constrain and could constrain an autocratic leader.
Yes, yeah, very good questions. I mean, I think on the first point, I mean, a lot of Americans for a long time have really believed in our checks and balances. I mean, and there's surveys going back quite a ways where Americans have a lot of faith in our Constitution. But one of the interesting things is the Constitution is a pretty short document. There's not a lot on the page. It's an old Constitution. It's a short Constitution, and a lot of what has made the Constitution work well and constrain autocratic-minded leaders or kind of very ambitious politicians in the past. We've had ambitious politicians in the past. Whether Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Richard Nixon. The Constitution has constrained these leaders, and so we might think that it should constrain future demagogues. But it turns out, I think, what the Trump experience has exposed is the degree to which a lot of the work is not only being done by the words on the page, but by a set of unwritten rules, what we call democratic norms that are associated with our Constitution. And two really in particular are worth mentioning because they are the things that make our Constitution, our checks and balances work. One is the norm, my co-author Steve Levitsky called
We seem to have lost Professor Ziblatt here for a second. Hopefully he comes back in a second. Oh, you're back. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
We lost you just as you were about to discuss the norm that Levitsky talks about.
Toleration. Sorry about that.
Toleration, great.
Yeah, mutual toleration is a norm that you essentially treat your rivals as legitimate, and that if they beat you, to govern. So no matter how much you dislike them or disagree with them, they have a right to compete for office, and if they beat you then in a fair and free election, they have a right to govern. So in other words, you don't treat your rivals as enemies. Now, this norm hasn't always been it hasn't always been present. It was hard to build back in the 1790s in the US when the Federalists and the Republicans, Adams and Jefferson, really despised each other and thought they were both enthralled to foreign powers. But it's a norm that's developed over time. Hello, I'm back again. I don't know what's.
You're back. The connection seems a little unstable. Sorry, that you were talking about the norm of toleration developing over time.
Yeah, yes. There's yeah, I'm sorry. I hope this doesn't keep happening. This might be a pain. During my talk, everything was okay though. Is that right?
It was, yeah. During the talk, it was perfect.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the second norm is the norm of forbearance, which is this norm of self-restraint, that you don't that politicians, there's an unwritten rule that politicians don't use every institutional power that they have at their prerogative. So think about, like, before the constitutional amendment was passed that allowed, that prohibited presidents from serving for more than 2 terms, between the time of George Washington until Franklin Roosevelt, no president ever even sought a 3rd term. These were very ambitious politicians. And the reason they didn't do this was not because of anything written on the page. It was an unwritten rule of self-restraint. Similarly, Congress, and the Senate can hold up any cabinet appointment of the president. We may see this happening, by the way, in January and afterwards, once Biden's president. But this, again, is an unwritten rule. So our checks and balances work with these 2 norms in place. Because if they are not in place, when rivals treat each other as enemies, and regard each other as enemies, then they are willing to use any institutional power they have to the max to prevent their opponent from coming to power. This is what we call constitutional hardball. And so, whether this means extreme measures, which are legal, but that kind of playing the letter of the law to the max, make our democracy fragile. So I think that so to answer the question, checks and balances can work, but they only work under conditions of low polarization, or they work best under conditions of low polarization where these 2 norms can remain intact. The second part of the question was, what institutional reforms are necessary?
Right, absolutely. There's a series of questions here from students around
Yes.
the question of sort of what
Yes.
can be done.
Yeah, so maybe, yes, okay. Well, I think, from my view, this polarization that I've been talking about, which I think is the underlying condition in American democracy, which gave us President Trump, which was exacerbated by him, but he's not the cause of it. Will continue after he's gone, is very asymmetric, in the sense that, my sense of it is that the Republican Party seems to be more of a threat, has moved more to the right than the Democrats have to the left. Now, I understand that people kind of can point to, there's Democratic Socialists in the Democratic Party, and so isn't that kind of equal polarization on both sides? But I think the big difference is that those voices in the Democratic Party, are not particularly critical of democracy in principle, are interested in expanding the vote. And B, they're not in the leadership of the party. The leadership of the Democratic Party is pretty much where it's always been. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are not raving left-wingers. In fact, they're very much criticized by their, these kind of younger voices often within the party. So the leadership of the party is quite moderate. The Republican Party, by contrast, has moved quite far to the right, including the leadership of the party. And this, there's recent studies by an organization called Varieties of Democracy out of Sweden, which ranks political parties in terms of their ideology. And whether, if one believes their account, the Republican Party has in fact moved far to the right and looks much more in its ideology, shares a lot more with radical right parties in Europe today than it does of traditional center-right parties. And I don't think Republicans would necessarily disagree with this. I mean, the American ambassador to Germany over the last several years, himself was quite explicit in embracing the far right party as an ally, much more than the German CDU, for instance. So that the Republican Party's gone far to the right. And I think this is the element. So the question in terms of institutional reform is how to moderate the Republican Party. And I think, so that's the challenge. And so the normal answer to that question in politics, the way parties change is by losing. You lose a lot of elections and then you change course. It's a little bit like a baseball team. If you lose a lot of games, you fire the manager, you hire new players, you come up with a new strategy. Similarly, if a political party loses elections, if it turned out the Republican Party learned that carrying out this kind of strategy that flirts with white nationalism doesn't pay, then they'll find a new strategy. The problem is, and this is a kind of a hitch, is that the Republican Party in our current constitutional order, because it's overrepresented in rural areas, is the beneficiaries in a way of what you can think of as kind of constitutional welfare, in the sense that rural areas are overrepresented in our Constitution. That's always been the case. the Electoral College, the Senate, overrepresents low start anytime there's an election. And so, sorry, I'm freezing up again a little bit.
You're back. You're back. It's fine. Sorry.
Yeah, Republicans get a kind of a head start in electoral competition. I mean, just to make this point clear, the Republican presidential candidates have only won one popular majority since 2000, in the last 20 years, in 2004. Democrats have won every other presidential election's popular vote, yet Republicans have governed 12 of those 20 years. And that's because the Electoral College benefits systematically the Republican Party. So Donald Trump had his Electoral College victory in 2016, despite winning the popular vote. Joe Biden has won by exactly the same margin in 2020 and had to win by 5 million votes in order to get that same majority. So, and similar stories in the Senate. The US Senate, regularly more Democrats, the US senators that represent Democrats get many more votes, but the Republicans retain control. Now, one might just say, well, these are just the rules of the game, and that's just how it is, and Democrats need to cope. But the reality is the Republicans face less incentive to reform because Republicans to begin to reach out to more diverse audiences. Because as long as they can win with minorities of the population, that is less than 50% of the population, they will remain potentially in the grips of a kind of white nationalist party. If, on the other hand, they have to win 50, 51, 52% of the vote to actually govern, they'll have to reach out to broader audiences. So the kinds of reforms that could do that include things such as protecting voting rights. And actually, we don't have to look very far. There's this great bill that I encourage all of the viewers here to go look at, House Resolution 1, which was passed by the House of Representatives in 2019, which included a whole series of measures to protect voting rights, allow for automatic voter registration, a whole series of reforms about campaign finance that essentially make it easier to vote. Anything that makes it easier to vote both empowers our democracy, which in its own terms is good, but it also has the effect of pushing Republicans to adopt more moderate stances. I'm in favor of a new Voting Rights Act, which was essentially defanged after a Supreme Court decision in 2013. The Voting Rights Act, which essentially requires that states, before they want to change voting rules, have to get Justice Department approval to make sure they're not disenfranchising certain segments of the population. I'm in favor of eliminating the Electoral College. I mean, that's a much steeper hill to climb, requires constitutional amendment, but that should be something that's on the reform agenda. You guys asked for the reform, so I'm going to list them all to you. Another big reform is adding 2 states to the United States, Puerto Rico, Washington D.C. I mean, these are voters who are disenfranchised, and this would alter the balance of power in the Senate. And then finally, the most modest reform of all, easiest to pass, what you need is am I frozen again? No.
You're
Philip.
back. You're fine.
So
Daniel, I'm sorry, we lost you there for a second.
Yeah, one other reform is reform of the antitrust laws regarding Comcast and Xfinity, which make it so that our internet connections aren't as good as they ought to be.
That's an excellent reform. So I'm gonna move us on to the next bunch of questions. In case you haven't seen, we have a tremendous amount of interest from students here. It's really great. Thank you everyone for all your questions. I'm sorry if we can't get through all of them. I have one question that's related to the media. Some students want to know how you see the media relating to the erosion of democratic norms or democracy in the United States. And the other is with disinformation and conspiracy theories like QAnon. So I thought we'd bundle those two together, those two questions, the media and conspiracy theories and disinformation. How you see that role playing itself out in the United States, and whether there are any parallels to Germany.
Yeah, good question. No, I mean, well, certainly there was no Facebook and Twitter, and yet Hitler could still come to power. So we can't place all of the blame on those particular technologies, although I think social media technology certainly exacerbates polarization, has these echo chamber effects, the spread of misinformation. And I think this is one of the terrible. Yes, sorry, I'm back again.
Sorry, we're running into real issues here.
Yes.
Why don't I ask one more question, and then we might wrap it up, because we do seem to be running into these stuff.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about this.
I'm sorry about this.
Yeah.
I have a question from my colleague Lenka Bustikova, which is, how do you see the role of uncivil society in leading to the collapse of Weimar democracy? I was wondering this myself. You called the Nazis a malignant social movement. Many students from America will be asking, how can a malignant social movement turn into a powerful political party so quickly, where they live in a two-party system in the United States? How could the Nazis go from being a small social movement to being a political party so quickly in Germany and garner so much support?
So, well, this is a little different than the uncivil society point, but I mean, clearly the proportional representation system helped this along. So in other words, made it much easier, whereas groups like QAnon get absorbed into the Republican Party, which is a terrible development. If this were a multi-party system, and you had a proportional system, you may have green parties on the left, but then you would also have a QAnon movement emerging. And the question would once again be, what role do the establishment politicians play in kind of fanning the flames to support this movement or not? I mean, I think there's lots of, this is connected to the social media question. I mean, QAnon was essentially created on Facebook, and social media, like technology in the Weimar era, facilitated the rise of these groups, and the kind of breakdown of these gatekeeper media institutions make it easier for these kinds of movements to emerge. But I continue to think that, despite that, we don't want to entirely blame Facebook. And I think the point I was going to make about Facebook is that there's this kind of legal protection of Facebook, that it can't be sued for misinformation on its site or slanderous material that like any newspaper could be sued for. There's a legal protection. This is something that a lot of people are pushing for a reform of, because then Facebook would be much more careful about what kind of information appears on its website. And this was originally created to allow for freedom of speech on social media, and it's a platform, not a media outlet. But increasingly, it's clear that there needs to be increased regulation of this. So, and not self-regulation alone. But in any case, civil society contains within it all sorts of uncivil elements. I mean, there's nothing new about this. When facing violence, disease, pandemics, economic unrest, it's more likely you're going to get more of this. And so that's why, we need to invest in our societies, protect our, and deal with COVID in a real way, because the kind of atmosphere of chaos and violence and insecurity generates uncivil society. But still, the question remains, how does this uncivil society get latched onto political elites? Because one job of politicians is not only to represent voters, but to keep what I described as malignant forces to the margins of politics. I mean, we're never going to stamp out all malignant forms of social movements. In a free society, you're going to get all sorts of conspiracy theories. The real challenge, throughout American history, we've had these movements. And so, what the real job is to keep these groups sidelined. And that's what failed to happen in Germany.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Ziblatt. I think I'm going to wrap things up here because although we've had a wonderful session, we are having some technical difficulties here and it's kind of becoming a bit of a problem. But I'd like to thank you once again. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. Thank the German Embassy, School of Politics and Global Studies, and Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU. This has been a great event. And thank you once again for joining us here at ASU. All the best with your work, and we hope to see you in person, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. Great to be with you guys.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.